Welcome to the Nurture Small Business Podcast. I'm your host, Denise Cagan, president of the DCA Virtual Business Support. At DCA, we believe in small businesses and the families they support. Learn more at dcavirtual.com. Hi, everybody. This is Denise coming to you live again. I am the president and founder of DCA Virtual Business Support and the host of Nurture Small Business Podcast. So if you have ever wanted to know all about podcasting, our guest is going to talk about podcasting. Now, why is that special? It is special because she's the host of the Media Casters, formerly known as Femcasters, and she is also she has a group where everybody collaborates and she helps people. There's a group of folks in there, and basically they help you podcast better. So I do have something I wanted to read. It's small. So on your Instagram profile, it reads, Mama Boys Podcaster at caremore.bebetter, plus at Femcasters activist, animal rescuer, mother of a dragon who's just trying to live well and do good. Our guest, Karina Bellizzi, is here to chat with us about all the benefits of podcasting, both as a guest and a host. Okay, so you have to explain the dragon part.
Well, if we had more time, I might go get her, but I have a bearded dragon that is the result of having boys and their obsession with all things lizards. So you think it's going to be your child's pet, but then it ends up being yours. And I personally didn't ever think that something like a bearded dragon would be an animal I'd fall in love with. But there are surprises around every corner, and it's a really sweet animal. I wouldn't have expected that some scaly reptile would want to cuddle, but she does. She's really sweet.
Oh, that is so interesting. I know nothing about bearded dragons, so that is really quite interesting. So we're going to be talking all about podcasts today. We have recorded a podcast already, which we'll be releasing, I think, at the end of May. And in our conversation afterwards, I just discovered a lot of really cool things about you. Like, for instance, what used to be Femcasters is now Media Casters. And then I'm sorry.
I need to update that profile. You just made me realize that.
Yeah, it's okay. Look, there's all sorts of stuff, but life moves fast, and sometimes you just don't catch everything at once. Mm-hmm. So on Media Casters, tell me a little bit about Media Casters and Femcasters, how it all got started and evolved.
Yeah, well, it all started on Clubhouse, and I want to shout out to Peace Love 13. That's Ashley. I met her on Clubhouse as well. She's one of my favorites from the space. And I got the chance to meet Julie Loken when we were collaborating on Clubhouse. She had started a podcast 2 months after mine called Obsessed with Humans on the Verge of Change. And we were both just really kind of confronted with this reality that women's voices weren't necessarily getting on the charts the same way as men's. Like Seth Rogen still has the #1 podcast for girls, women in their early 20s, and we're #4 and kind of goes between those two. And it really kind of shocked me in a way. And I felt like, there needs to be more effort to help people realize the potential of their voices, help them get out there and really create platforms to be heard. And there are numerous ways that you can do that. Podcasting can be really cheap to do, and you can throw a lot of money at it. It just is really the game that you want to play and how you want to play it ultimately. And so we kind of joined together, decided to first launch as Femcasters because we were celebrating the voices of women and really focusing on them. And then shortly after we did that, we realized that some of our biggest champions were actually men. And some men in our community who were vibrant and thriving and really pushing for us to create more change. And I'm like, it feels duplicitous every time I have to sit here and say, oh, well, we have some man casters too. But at the same time, those people that were part of that early kind of effort, they're still really engaged and a part of this. And I'm proud of them and everything they're working to become. We've supported the launch of several podcasts now, one in the comedy space, another in the cultural kind of travel space, a few in the personal and professional development space. and some hobbyists as well. So, I mean, all of this to really say that, every voice counts and matters. And as we explore things like social audio with Clubhouse and also spots like the Wisdom app, I think people get more confident in their own voices. And then they can step into themselves and be a part of a community that supports them and eventually perhaps launch their own podcast, become more adept at public speaking. Maybe they launch a public speaking career. Maybe they write a book. And so essentially we shifted Femcasters from something that was more focused on women to something that is helping people at the intersection of podcasting, public speaking, and publishing. And so we're supporting their journey. We're interviewing people who are specialists in those spaces. Julie had a publishing company. She still does. It's kind of been folded into the Media Casters. I'm working on the edit of a book that we're launching soon on just using your voice through media like audio, whether it be podcasting or social audio and things along these lines.
So I want to back up just a tiny bit. Talk about Clubhouse and how all of that works. I'm a little bit familiar with it, but not, I've used Lunch Club a bit, but not Clubhouse.
Yeah, and so Clubhouse, it really is a social audio platform. So you don't have to worry about how you look and how polished you are visually. You can really focus on your voice, right? And you can observe as a listener and just hang out in the audience, or you can raise your hand and come up to stage and converse with the people that are there. There's all sorts of little small etiquette pieces that exist within the Clubhouse realm, which are really intended to help people that might come from a variety of backgrounds. Like, let's say you're differently abled, or you could even be blind and you only go by voice, so you can't see things as well. So you'll come to stage and you'll say, "This is Karina, and here's what I have to share. Thanks so much. I'm done speaking. This has been Karina." Or, you basically sign on and sign off, but using only your voice at the beginning and end of each time you speak. Some people will say, "And I am complete," or "And I am done," but just really giving a verbal cue for when somebody else can speak. And so some of these things are just kind of, I think, polite and common sense. But it also is interesting to see that a social platform like this can develop its own kind of etiquette and way of connecting with and conversing with people. You can create a pretty in-depth background on your profile on Clubhouse, and you can develop connections and relationships with people voice to voice in a way that's different from other social platforms.
That's interesting. Reminds me of the old ham operators where they would say over at the end of whatever they were saying. That is a great verbal cue, though, because even sometimes now on Zoom calls, if there's a little bit of a lag, we wind up talking over each other, and not intentionally at all, but it just happens. So I love that. In my understanding now, Clubhouse, is that the platform that came out iOS only at first?
Yeah. Most of them do, honestly. So that one did come out iOS only at first. Same is true of the Wisdom app. That's a new one that is actually women owned and women run. The primary difference with the Wisdom app is that there can only be 2 people on stage at a time. So you have the one person who's hosting and another person who's on as a guest. It can be a little less intimidating for people. You can hang out in the audience. You don't have to come to stage. Sometimes if you come to stage in Clubhouse, it can feel like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be called on and now I have to speak. And sometimes you're not in a space where you want to be called on. So there's all sorts of different ways to connect with people. What I like about the Wisdom app is that Dio Akinrenade, who's the founder of that space, it's not another tech bro run company. I'm sorry, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I mean, Clubhouse is started by 2 dudes from Silicon Valley. I mean, how many times have we heard this story, right? And she is a Black woman in the UK who's worked in tech for a long time, and she started this thing. She'd run a singles app that was intended for Black Europeans, and then just transitioned the skill set when she really liked what Clubhouse was doing and could see a different way to do it. So she started the Wisdom app. It also started out iOS only, but in April just launched also on the Droid platform, the phone I'm speaking to right now. So I'm a Droid
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm an Android person, so that was why I was asking about that.
You had to actually get an iPad in order to access Clubhouse earlier. So,
oh wow. Proprietary software. Oh yes, we know how that goes. Okay, so Clubhouse in Wisdom. Great way to practice your verbal skills. I was literally speaking to somebody earlier today about this. It was just a networking meeting. It wasn't a sales call. It wasn't anything else. He's a Goldman Sachs, 10,000 small business. He's actually not an alumni yet. He's in the program right now. And I am an alumni from 2019. So we were talking, and we were talking about podcasting specifically. And one of the things I shared with him, I was like, it widens my network. I meet some fantastic people. And this is me hosting. Okay. I do occasionally guest, but I mostly host. I learn something from every single guest. Okay. Every single guest, I learn something. So I'm expanding my knowledge. I'm expanding my horizons. I learn stuff. Sometimes I hear views that are totally not mine, but I respect that. And I want to hear that. I'm a firm believer that if you don't hear dissenting views, how do you know what you really believe? Okay.
I totally agree. And here's the thing, like I consider myself kind of a budding environmentalist. I've considered myself that for over 20 years. So I don't know at what point I would actually say, oh, I am this. I'm an environmentalist too, right? But the focus of my primary podcast, Care More, Be Better, which is what I launched initially last January, was really focused on social impact sustainability and also this concept of regeneration, like building regenerative businesses, a circular economy, things along these lines, being a better not only personal citizen, corporate citizen. What does that look like? How do you vote with your dollars? How does it make sense? At what point does a company actually take charge and own their responsibility versus just pushing it off on all of us, right? So all of these big questions. And the reality is, when I first started interviewing guests along these lines, I wasn't as expert as I am by this point. And so I interviewed a lot of people who had a lot of experience helping companies build their social responsibility campaigns and things along those lines. I'd initiated some of those within the companies I worked in. But at the same time, your view is only what it is, right? So by the end of conducting several interviews, suddenly I'm interviewing Paul Hawken, who's really well known in that space. And I felt like I could hold my own in a conversation with him. And so it just felt like I leveled up my understanding, not only of what I already knew, but also continue to just add more to my knowledge base. And if I'm curious about something, I can interview guests along those lines and really kind of discover more, build connections, and think about it even as potentially a career pivot down the road. Because if I choose to say, I don't want to be necessarily working in consumer products anymore, I really want to explore something that's more along these lines, I feel like I've opened the door to it, right?
Absolutely. And while you're expanding your mind and learning more and making these connections, you're also honing your skills for public speaking and just creating connection with other beautiful human beings.
Well, and the reality is, last couple of years, I haven't been on a stage because guess what? COVID, right? So I'm going to be speaking at a conference for the first time in a few years because honestly, with the birth of my boys and momhood, I hadn't traveled as much as I used to. I hadn't been putting myself up to do additional travel and be on stage in other spots either. But I'm going to be speaking on stage at PodFest in Florida at the end of the month. And so anybody who is in the podcasting space, if you happen to be going to PodFest on Thursday, I think around midday, we're going to be talking about using community to ultimately improve your street cred and build your audience and things along these lines for the world of podcasting. So I think that will be really fun.
And that is part of what you focus on MediaCasters also, is that not?
Yeah, I mean, we're so community focused. And I'll give you a really great example of that, right? Like one of the things that I remain super passionate about is I think in the world of podcasting, it's really hard to get in front of another audience because the space is being flooded by people who are already famous. Michelle Obama decides to start her podcast. Oh, look, Jason Bateman and a couple of his friends, also comedians, are starting a podcast SmartList. It keeps going on. And then they're backed by big money because they're sponsored by Spotify or Amazon or now Wondery, and the list keeps growing. And so as an independent podcaster, it gets harder to be heard. So we launched on Earth Day, Pod Tease, which is a new podcast that I hadn't told you about yet.
Ooh, okay. I knew you had a new one coming.
Yeah. So this one is just really focused on sharing podcasts with people that they might not otherwise hear. So if you follow Pod Tease, we just started an Instagram page at Pod Tease, like pod striptease, but not striptease. It's just the artwork makes it look a little bit like it's like that because we're unveiling new potential favorites every week. We release an episode or two each Friday. And so last week I focused on just one podcast because it was the end of Autism Awareness Month. So I featured an autistic podcaster that I know and love. And then, and that is Beyond 6 Seconds with Carolyn Keel. At the time she conducted this interview of an autism influencer, she had not yet been diagnosed, but suspected she might be autistic. So it was like really kind of this pivotal podcast. Mm-hmm. And then the week before, because it was Earth Day, we pushed forth my podcast episode with Care More Be Better of Paul Hawken, because it's Paul Hawken. And then also an episode of the Vertical Farm podcast hosted by Harry Duran, because vertical farming is part of like food solutions for the future. Are there going to be tech aspects to solving climate crises? All really cool information. So each week we're going to showcase 1 to 2 podcasts, sometimes perhaps even more, just so that people can hear about other podcasts they might not otherwise discover, that don't end up on Apple's New and Noteworthy, that don't have a big budget behind them, but that are really good podcasts. So if anybody listening is a podcaster, you can apply. We have a simple form for that. Just reach out via Instagram or wherever, and I'll be happy to send it over to you. It's just a simple form.
That is Pod Tease, all run together?
Yeah, Pod Tease.
Okay, perfect. You'll be hearing from me.
And we're just asking for people to showcase their favorite episode. Like it might be an episode that for one reason or another you just feel is like awesome, even if it didn't get as many listens as the others, and or your best performing show. And then we basically do this. We record a 2 to 3 minute intro, like why we like it, why we chose it, and then we play your podcast end to end.
Perfect. That sounds ideal and a great way. It's a great way to get your name out there. I love the fact that you're a podcaster and supporting other podcasters, and that your starts actually came from off podcasting, in Clubhouse. That's pretty incredible. I love that. Mm. So I want to speak just a little bit about Podfest, because you had mentioned it to me and I don't think I'm going to be able to get there. However, what else is going on at Podfest?
Well, I've never been. This will be my first time. I did the virtual last year when they didn't have an in-person, and it's a lot of different workshops. Essentially, they'll host some on the main stage, which are the big names that are speaking at the event, right? But most of them are in breakout rooms, like the one I'll probably be in with 30 or so people. And you're essentially in sessions where they're helping you up your game, improve your exposure, learn about other monetization paths. There's different tracks. So one track might be on mental health and podcasting. That's something that we discussed doing when I was actually connecting with the founder, Chris Krimitsos. There's a mental health aspect to podcasting because it builds connection. It helps you feel more connected in an isolated world. So there's that piece. There's a track that I know is for budding podcasters or people that are new to podcasting. And then there are others that are more for those that are experts or really kind of working to up their games. So a lot of it is kind of marketing intelligence. I'm a marketer. I have my MBA, and I've gone through all these stretches of building consumer facing brands in the natural products industry. Like that's my wheelhouse and home. I've adapted a lot of what I know to the world of podcasting, but that doesn't mean I'm an expert in every digital media and advertising. So I'll be attending a lot of those sessions myself and looking for tips and tricks that I didn't already think of.
Absolutely. Always increasing the knowledge so that we can do better. We know better, do better.
The other thing I'll say is I think it's really just a huge networking event. I understand that a couple of years back, there were more than 2,000 people there. So a big kind of event. There were headliners like the podcasters who run the Dollop. Like I know they did one of them back in like 2019 or 2020, I think. So, some big names that might be speaking at the event. And I honestly haven't seen the final list. So looking forward to that myself.
Okay. So what is one piece of advice that you would give to people who want to start their own podcast? What is the number one thing that you think they need to think about before they start the podcast?
I really do think the hard work of deciding why you're doing it is really important in the beginning. Like, what is it that you're hoping to get out of it? Why are you doing it? What is it going to say about your brand? How are you going to measure your success? Because if you're coming to podcasting to just suddenly think it'll replace your day job in 6 months, that is not likely to happen. You'd be like the one in a trillion if that were the case. You have to understand what your real goals are in it. And then I would say the second to that is practice. And that is, buying, it can be an inexpensive microphone. This is my Audio Technica here. Oh, I need to have my ring light set up here. This is my Audio Technica. This is a $79 microphone. It's not expensive, right? That's what I started podcasting with, plugged in directly to my computer. I then have since upgraded to the Shure.
Ooh,
It's a nice microphone. It's a very nice one. This telescoping arm is like more professional. It's not as rickety as the other one I just showed you, but like, you don't have to do it all at once. You go in stages, and as you get more involved in it, you might decide that you want to buy another gadget to help support your game, but it's not needed in the beginning. So what I would say, and final piece of that, is join the media casters, because we're there to help you. We'll help you figure it out. And, maybe podcasting is for you and you're going to do it. Maybe it's not, and that's okay too. Or maybe you just want to go out there and guest and get on other people's shows to tell your story. And that's a possibility too. That's good practice.
It is great practice. So are you on Instagram also for Media Casters? We can just tag at Media Casters.
Yeah, it's at the Media Casters because we couldn't own the URL. So we just did the Media Casters on everything. And so you can find us on any social platform that way. You can find us at PodTease. And I believe, this is my personal account, Karina.Belizzi here. I'm on Instagram mostly as my other profile, so these days.
No worries. Okay, so let's flip to the other side just a little bit and talk about guesting for a little bit. Like I said, I mostly do hosting. I am occasionally on as a guest. I'm actually pretty uncomfortable being a guest most of the time.
Yeah. Well, this is something I didn't expect. I thought I would have a harder time with that as well. But the reality is I had been guests on radio shows, in person, in studio, with the on-air like button and all that. That was what I was thinking guesting was going to be like for me. But it really isn't. There wasn't for me that added pressure of the on-air button. I had this comfortability understanding that the person I'm talking to was recording this and they would probably edit if I said 6 times or whatever, So I just kind of relaxed into it. And I found that I really enjoyed the ad hoc conversations I had being on the other side of the mic. When I interview someone, I have to do a fair amount of research to make sure I, can guide the conversation. And so I feel actually a little bit more pressure being on that side. That being said, after probably my 15th podcast episode, I was so comfortable that I didn't have to do quite as much prep work. And I actually found that, if I just had their bio in front of me and had listened to a podcast or two that they'd guested on, I had a feel for them, I was comfortable with guiding the conversation and felt it would be awesome. So now I feel like I'm kind of on this equal space. But the thing I will say just about me personally is as long as I feel like I'm expert in something, I can guest all day long and it doesn't feel like a lot of pressure. I'm expert in me. So if it's going to be about me in some way, you just get comfortable and say, okay, it's like I'm talking to a friend. I'm just doing it over a screen and with a microphone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what advice would you give to people who want to guest on podcasts?
Well, number one is listen to the podcast you want to guest on first and say, do I like the way this host runs things? Because you are also, in a way, a client of that guest because they're going to be using your content to help drive their content. It should be something you're proud to be on, okay, I know I'm going to get a good quality content out of this piece. So now I'll go ahead and share that with the world. I'll feel comfortable sharing it with the world. So that's number one. Number two, there are a lot of tools that you can use for free to find out what podcasters are actually looking for guests on their shows. There's Podmatch, there's Audrey.io, there's a couple others that I have used and not enjoyed as much, so I won't mention them, but yeah, there's many out there. And you can basically create your profile, search for podcasts, and send them a message directly through the platform. Some will respond, some don't. That's just the nature of it.
Yeah, those are the two that I've primarily used. And I would say Podmatch primarily. I actually got the opportunity to interview the founder, Alex Sanfilippo. He
Yeah,
was really
he's a
awesome.
nice guy. Yeah. So very good. Yeah, I like the way that one's architected myself. And I've found that the people that reached out to me from Podmatch were, I didn't feel like I was just a number that they were sending a message to. And
Mm.
so I think on some of the other platforms, that's how it's felt like, oh, they're sending the same exact message to everybody. Love your podcast. Want to come guest? Okay. So I snarky reply, you could say in my seat, which one? Because I've got a few. But I mean, I really don't think in some cases that people have actually listened to the show when they say love your podcast. And I would just say, be genuine. You know, if you're going to say you love their podcast, at least know what podcast you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually pulled that tactic that you mentioned, like, oh, which one? I've done it on LinkedIn with people like, oh, yeah, I found you through some of your colleagues. Oh, which ones? What do you think about, I don't know, I call them podcast chasers. I know there's a pod chaser channel also, but people who reach out and broker podcasts, I guess, on behalf of guests. What do you think about
Like
that?
Kitcaster
Is
is
that
for example. I think
worthwhile?
I get, yeah, Kitcaster,
Yeah.
something Hamilton. I get hit by a few of them.
Interview, valet. Yeah, there's a bunch of them out there.
Yeah, there are quite a few. I don't know. I have mixed things to say. I think some of them are organized a little better than others. I will say I actually my breadcrumb trail to Paul Hawkins started with one of them. So, you know, it's like one of them reached out and said, "Hey, we have this David Johnson, who's a Stanford professor of law and also design thinking. I'm a marketer. I love design thinking. Okay. But I'm like, okay, okay, but what is the story he's working to tell? Because my show is about social impact and sustainability. And how does it connect? Well, it turns out that he wanted to write a book on design thinking as it relates to climate activism and using some of the tactics from design thinking for climate activism. Okay, yeah, this sounds like this could be interesting. Interview him. He mentioned Paul Hawkins' upcoming book, Regeneration. I reached out to Paul Hawkins through his site, not knowing that David Johnson is his neighbor.
Ah,
So it was like one of these things where I probably had the perfect storm work in my favor because in my mention, I said, David Johnson mentioned you. I just interviewed him on my podcast. He might have had a nice thing or two to say about his interview with me. So it all led to me being able to interview, let's say for the masses, maybe a lesser known name, but a celebrity in the world of climate activism.
yeah, yeah. I think they do. I think those brokers or whatever they're called, I think they do have the value. I think that as a host, I feel it's best that, I make sure I communicate to them, like, here's my guest criteria.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them are super responsive to that. I guess from a guest perspective, my understanding is that runs 600 to 700 on the starting side per month for a couple of podcasts. And
no, they're charging, I think, on average about $200 to $500 per booking, depending on the agent. Yeah. So they might say, we'll book you on 4 shows for the month. It's $2,000.
Right. Exactly.
It's very expensive for the project that it is. But if you're thinking about it from an entrepreneur standpoint and you don't have somebody who's expert in booking for podcasts, what are you going to do? Throw an administrator at it, take them off of other job duties that are more important? Maybe not. So I think it can make sense as a service. I have had a handful that I've interviewed from some of these other services that I've really liked, really enjoyed. Energy Ogre is an example. I think they came to me from Kitcaster. That's a company in Texas that helps optimize energy usage for Texans and has saved them about 40% of what they've typically paid for their power bills. That's pretty cool, right? It also means you're using less energy. You've optimized your usage and now you're paying less money. That's all great, right? So I've got to have some really interesting discussions with people I otherwise might not have known about. And so some of them I think are doing really good work. The one that comes to mind most is Kitcaster, just because I get contacted by them most. One of them that kept sending me guests that didn't seem like they fit my ethos, I sent them a note back and said that I charged to bring entrepreneurs on, and they stopped contacting me.
That's That's a very creative way to solve that problem.
I'm like, well, each show costs me $200 to produce, which is true. That's about how much it costs me, plus my time, energy, effort, all that. So I'm just like, if they aren't willing to share in the cost, I'm not willing to interview entrepreneurs. But I did say at the same time, if they were not-for-profits, I would still consider interviewing them. I interview a lot of not-for-profits. I enjoy interviewing not-for-profits. Authors, I enjoy interviewing authors. But if it's just entrepreneurs coming to me that just want to sell something, that's not what I'm here to do.
No, I totally get it. So the takeaways today are to network, learn, hone your skills, practice, and be flexible. You might need a podcast broker, or you might want to do the research on your own, and use the free tools. There's lots of free tools out there.
Yeah, there are a ton of free tools, and they're really good at helping you, parse through the junk. I will say too, network, just even for that, like you say, like one of the things I ask my guests is, what shows have you guested on that you really liked? And then I'll hear about a podcast I've never heard about before, and I'll reach out to them and say, gosh, I just want to let you know that this guest had this nice thing to say about you, because I felt like, God, how great would that feel as the host of that show, right? To hear the compliment happened when you weren't in the room. I mean, it's just a nice gift. And then to listen to that show and see if there's other people I might recommend go on it. I mean, I do that all the time. I think it's the power of connection.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I was thinking about somebody that I may need to introduce you to for one of your shows. Okay, so Karina, I know we mentioned it throughout, but your tags for Instagram, if you could repeat them, and I'll make sure that they go into the notes as well.
Fantastic. At the Mediacasters for everything related to media, and at PodTease if you have a podcast that you'd like to submit, but you can reach me from both spaces. I will also just say that if you are interested in joining the community, it's themediacasters.mn.co. It's a Mighty Networks run platform. You can join it for free and be a part of the community.
All right, that sounds great. I really appreciate you joining me today for our Small Business Week celebration. This will also show up as a podcast later.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good day. Thank you for joining me for today's Nurture Small Business podcast, where the focus is on business growth, technology, and people strategies to help your business thrive. At DCA Virtual Business Support, our focus is making your business operations run smooth so you can focus on growth. Reach out to me at Denise@dcavirtual.com if you'd like to learn more.